Thank you very much for participating in this last session of our seminar. You're now teaching at the University of Plymouth, at the School of Law, Humanities and Social Sciences. You just told me that you recently became an emeritus, and your research has been focusing and focuses still on risk communication, particularly in terms of environmental issues and health. You've written many papers, books, and one important book is the Media, Culture and the Environment, and another one is Media, Environment and the Network Society. And you've also been adjunct professor in the School of Social Sciences in Australia, Monash University. Nowadays, you're probably going to tell us more about your current research, but you're also a research lead for a research group called the Environment, Culture and Society. And for us, it's the last session of this seminar. We've had 12 sessions, and it was my first year getting into this field of environment. It's been a very, very interesting experience. I hope it has been the case for the participants as well. And so I'm going to give you the floor immediately. Thank you once more for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this, and it's great to be part of this seminar series. So I'm going to give you really an overview of some of the work that I've been doing. As you mentioned, I've been researching environmental communication, I think it's for about the past over 30 years now. And most of my research in the early days focused on the role of the media in communicating environmental issues. But over more recent years, my research has started to focus much more on looking at the education system, particularly focusing on secondary schools. So in the UK, that caters for students who are 11 years and older. So I'm going to kind of begin the talk by giving a little bit of background to some of the key issues and why it's so important to examine the role of education in relation to some of the huge challenges that we face at the moment relating to climate change. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about an earlier study that I conducted, and then move on to talk about the principal one that I'm going to focus on today, which is a study that was carried out in conjunction with the British Science Association and involved mixed methods. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings from the survey and also some of the really interesting, rich data that we got from focus group discussions with secondary school students in the UK. And then finally, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the findings from a survey that I carried out of, it's a nationwide survey again, of teachers in the UK and their views about embedding climate change education right across the curriculum so that it features in every single subject area. And then I'll finally sort of conclude with some reflections on this. So please do stop me if you have any questions as I go along. But if not, I look forward to taking some questions and hearing your thoughts at the end of the presentation.
Sorry, and you can also put your questions in the chat if you don't want to interrupt. And you can also ask questions in French and we can translate here if necessary.
Great, thank you. I wish my French was better. The thing to note, I think, at the beginning is that we are facing a number of intersecting crises. The climate change crisis, we can see many sort of effects from it. If you think of Storm Goretti in Europe and how, we had extremely high winds. Myself, actually, I was affected by this because I live on the edge of Cornwall, and Cornwall in the UK Parts of Cornwall are on the coast and were really affected by Storm Goretti. We had a huge tree that came down from woodland at the edge of our garden, which smashed into 2 trees. So we're still trying to figure out how to, chop that up and remove the tree. And of course, these multiple intersecting crises of climate change, of biodiversity loss, of the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the mental health crisis amongst young people, these connect in various ways. And the devastating consequences of climate change clearly are far more apparent in developing countries, that haven't got the kind of structure and ability to kind of often withstand some of these challenges to the same extent that we have, although even in Europe we are struggling with some of the results of flooding and so on and so forth, which have damaged the infrastructure. So why does education matter? Well, potentially education can increase people's awareness and their ability to respond to some of these damaging effects and make us more resilient. Potentially, education can encourage individual behaviour change. And in fact, studies suggest that behavioural change, and of course, education is part of this, can mitigate between 20 and 37% of global emissions by 2050. Education can empower collective action, and it can also foster the necessary green skills that we need to be able to tackle climate change. However, having said that, it certainly is very challenging, because we know that just providing more and more information about climate change doesn't necessarily result in action. There's a model called the information deficit model in communication studies, which is based on the assumption that the more information you give to individuals, the more they are likely to absorb that information and change their behaviour. But we know through decades of communication research that that is far too simplistic. There are so many barriers that affect, the ability to actually change our behaviour. If you think about, a good example of this, I think, is that we've known for years that there's a major danger posed by not wearing a seatbelt in a car. Numerous studies have showed in the past the consequences of not wearing a seatbelt and being involved in an accident. And despite the public knowing the dangers, for years and years, people used to drive around not wearing seatbelts, even though seatbelts were in cars. And in the end, a law had to be introduced to ensure that people, did wear their seatbelts. Another example is that we know increasingly from, a lot of research about the dangers of ultra-processed foods, and we know that eating these kind of foods has major health impacts, and yet often we continue to eat these foods because they are convenient. And a lot of our behaviour, I think, also is influenced by habits, long-standing habits, and those can be really, really difficult to change. So this is why education really does matter. But as I'm going to kind of talk about later on in this presentation, it's not just a simple matter of giving people information and then they will change their action. The way in which we talk about climate change has to kind of connect with people at a personal, emotional level, really, to engage them, to change their behaviour. So often through things like powerful stories, powerful examples that actually touch people and encourage them to rethink their behaviour. And also when we're talking about young people as well, to some extent they have less agency than adults because, you know, a lot of what they do is governed by their parents and living within, you know, a family situation. So that's worth bearing in mind as well, particularly for younger students. As I was saying, that the science is now settled on climate change is clearly more of a kind of political and communications challenge now. And there's been considerable bias within the media over time, and what many communication scholars have referred to as false balance, where in the past the media attempted to give equal sides of the to give equal space to both sides of the debate, which gave the impression that scientists were kind of undecided about whether climate change was real. We've gone past that now. But even so, as recently as 2021, in the UK, geography students have online resources provided by the BBC called BBC Bite Size. And as recently as 2021, in these resources, they listed some of what they claimed were the positive impacts of climate change, including things like more resources such as oil becoming available when the ice melts, energy consumption decreasing due to a warmer climate, and so on and so forth. And there was an outcry about, you know, this, which led to them being removed. So some of these issues, you know, around misinformation are also affecting the education sector as well as more widely within the media. And what we've seen over time is that some of the very powerful industry groups have employed various PR companies and aligned with special interest lobbies to deliberately set out to manipulate some of the science and, you know, have use the news media to try and do this. A good example of this is the American Enterprise Institute, who are one of the biggest oil companies, funded by ExxonMobil, one of the biggest oil companies. And they actually offered scientists and economists £10,000 each if they would write articles that would undermine the release of an IPCC report. And you can read more about this there's a fascinating book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt, which gives more of a kind of in-depth insight into the kind of tactics that have been used over time to dispute some of the evidence. And I mean, we also see this with ClimateGate as well, which, as it became known, took place in 2009, just in the run-up to the Copenhagen COP climate summit, when more than 1,000 climate scientists' emails were hacked into and made public. And, you know, this caused a real scandal and led, you know, people to start doubting whether what the scientists were saying was actually real. But following this, there was an independent inquiry which found no evidence whatsoever of any fraud on the part of the climate scientists at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And they never quite got to the bottom of, you know, how this hacking occurred, although from some of the evidence, it appeared that it could have come from Russia. And so, behind the scenes, there is this really fierce battle going on. And there's an interesting book, I don't know if any of you have come across, written by Michael Mann, called The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. And he argues that it's kind of gone a stage further, and the tactic now is to try and delay action as much as possible and kind of muddy the water. The big interests that are being threatened, particularly, some of the big oil companies, are doing their utmost to try and delay and also sow the seeds of doubt to kind of muddy the waters around some of the solutions to the problems that we face. Even with the COP 2028, this is another example where, again, there was a lot of controversy around this, and it was discovered that numerous fake Twitter accounts started popping up promoting COP 28 and the president, who was quite a controversial figure. And there's a really interesting article that was published in The Guardian. You've got the link there, which also revealed how many of these Twitter accounts were completely fake. As you can see at the example there, they've actually forgotten to crop this person, the fact that this person does not exist. So it's really in this context that education is vitally important, because we see so much misinformation and deliberate disinformation circulating around on social media, and it's something that educators have to navigate, and students. And there has been some research that has been conducted more within the kind of global context to look at, how much climate change actually features within curricula in numerous countries around the globe. And there's an interesting study report that was produced by UNESCO recently that found that almost 70% of grade 9, so grade 9 is sort of students aged between 14 and 15, almost 70% of curricula contain no references whatsoever to climate change. And what they found was that, in many countries, increasing attention is being given to environmental issues, but not specifically to climate change. And some of the themes that I'm going to be talking about in a moment that emerged from my own research are also prevalent. So a focus, where climate change is talked about, it tends to focus on the causes of climate change and the impacts of climate change, but not the solutions, which is, as I'm going to be arguing later on, a major problem. So just to give you a little bit of background to the study, to the Future Forum research that I carried out with the British Science Association, this project really represented a response to numerous calls that we need a much bolder approach to climate education. And I carried out an earlier, more small-scale study which focused on looking at young people's attitudes towards climate change and knowledge about it, which was based on a study of some schools in the southwest of England, so in Devon and Cornwall. And the 4 schools that we looked at varied quite dramatically in terms of their intake. So it included some schools where some of the young people were from quite deprived backgrounds, and other ones, you know, where students came from more kind of middle class backgrounds. And the video that we produced, because I worked in conjunction with a filmmaker and an artist, and we showed this kind of interactive game that the students got involved with within these workshops. This was exhibited at COP26 in the Green Zone in Glasgow. So I'm just going to actually show you a short clip from this research, which I think you get a flavour of, you know, some of the students' frustrations around what's going on with climate change. So if you just bear with me, I'm just going to play this clip.
As usual, we don't have the sound.
Can you hear it okay?
No, we don't hear the sound. It's the second time it happens. I don't know what in the setting makes it like that, but
Oh no, that's a shame.
yeah.
Because I can hear it. I can try turning up my sound.
Yeah.
Hang on. I'll just see if that works. I don't know if it's going to.
If it's online, if you could send a link. Maybe after the seminar. If we let's first try with your sound.
Okay. Yeah, see, the sound is right up, so it should, in theory, play. Can you hear it now?
No.
No. Oh, sorry. What I'll have to do then is send you the link afterwards. Sorry about that. It's a shame because it's a really good clip as well. I can just quickly summarize what the students are saying, really. Sorry, I'll just get back to. Yeah, so just to quickly summarise, and I'll send you the link afterwards so you can play it yourself. It's showing some students talking about their frustrations because they feel as though they are being blamed for climate change, and they feel as though you know, the government and other people in authority are expecting them to be the people to sort out climate change. They feel that they have very little agency, and they also kind of exhibit a lack of trust, really, in politicians to be able to really deal with climate change. And it's clear that there's an awful lot of anxiety amongst young people in relation to climate change. And some others in the group feel that, you know, individual actions don't really make much of a difference. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment in relation to the larger study that I carried out. So just to give you some background to climate education in the UK, in April 2022, the Department of Education published this new, what they call their new sustainability and climate change strategy. And in this document, they committed to, in their words, putting climate change at the heart of education. However, this strategy came in for quite a lot of criticism because currently climate change is marginalised within the school curriculum, and it'll be interesting to hear a bit more actually about you know, how climate change features within the curriculum in France. And of course, there are variations in the UK because, we have a kind of devolved setup. So, there are differences between what's going on in Scotland, for example, and Wales compared to the rest of the country. More recently, there's been a nationwide curriculum and assessment review that's taken place, and the final report was recently published last autumn in November. And this was slightly more positive, really, I think, even though in its original call for evidence, they said that they were looking for evolution, not revolution. So right from the beginning, when this curriculum assessment review was set up, it's very clear that, the terms of it were, particularly because there's so many issues at the moment with education in the UK. We have crumbling school buildings, lack of funding, which has been going on for ages. That it was very much framed as something that would be evolution and not actually involve radical change. And of course, this also has been criticised as maybe not going far enough. But anyway, there have been some kind of positive steps towards increasing climate education within the curriculum, such as making citizenship studies compulsory, with focusing on media literacy skills, which are absolutely crucial, particularly in the light of what I was talking about before, with misinformation and disinformation, and also more emphasis on talking about some of the issues to do with climate change within citizenship studies, and then also increasing climate education in science, geography, and design and technology. But what many of us have been arguing is that climate change needs to feature in every single subject right across the curriculum. So although this goes, this doesn't really go far enough, is what I'm saying. And then also, another factor that I think is really important is that we face in the UK, and I'm sure it's the case also in France, a major skills shortage in the green economy. And education, as I mentioned at the beginning, is vital to prepare young people for these jobs. And numerous studies have found that young people in the UK have a very limited understanding of what a green career is. And currently in schools, there's very little attention that's given to encouraging young people to think about green careers. And, we are going to need many more engineers who are skilled in, installing heat pumps. We have a major problem with also garages, in that most of the garage technicians who service cars can just service petrol and diesel cars, and we don't have enough technicians coming through who are able to service electric vehicles. So, and beyond that, it's not just about those obvious careers, but I think we need to view green careers in the widest sense possible, because every sort of employer needs to be aware of the challenges lying ahead of us, and how they can make their own organisation or company as sustainable as possible. So there have been a number of surveys which have looked at young people's experiences of climate education in the UK, and I've got a list of references at the end of this presentation if you're interested in exploring this further, including also some qualitative work involving focus group studies. But in the past, there's been a bit of a tendency of some of the surveys to rely on getting teachers to recruit people to take part in the surveys, which can be problematic because they haven't always been particularly representative. And there's a danger that sometimes those students who are most likely to take part in the surveys are already quite concerned about climate change. And also there's the issue of how do you prevent some people completing the surveys who, perhaps aren't students or, part of the particular, samples that you're trying to get to complete it. And then sometimes they've often included both primary and secondary school students, which is fine, but, sometimes it's important to kind of get more of a kind of in-depth perspective around, particular age groups rather than trying to cover too wide an age group. So I'm just going to go on now to just briefly talk about some of the findings from the study that I undertook, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and was undertaken in conjunction with the British Science Association. So this was a mixed method study. It involved an online survey where we commissioned one poll to conduct this during January 2023, and it involved 1,000 young people aged between 14 and 18 across the UK, and it was representative in terms of the national profile and in terms of gender and age and so on. And then we supplemented this with 2 exploratory in-depth workshops. Again, these were students aged between 14 and 18, taken from right across the UK. And we split these students into smaller focus group discussions arranged around, the particular age group. So we had some focus groups with the younger students and some with the older ones. And this was to kind of follow up some of the major findings from the survey. So what did we find? Well, we found that there was a very strong appetite for climate education amongst the young people. Over 70% said that they would welcome the opportunity to learn more about climate change in school, and almost 70% agreed that it should be embedded across the curriculum. One thing that should be borne in mind in terms of limitations with this particular survey is that the young people who were recruited were young people who regularly take part in British Science Association future forums. So they were all students who were interested in science and taking science subjects. So perhaps you could argue that there might have been more of a kind of appetite for climate change education amongst these particular students. So one of the questions we asked them was, which issues did they view as being more important or most important in terms of improving our lives within the future? And we found that the most important issue that they identified was climate change. And this came above things like the cost of living, above even young people's mental health and well-being. It was quite noticeable that climate change, was perceived to be, the most important issue affecting us within the future. However, interestingly, we found that...
Alison, can you just explain how the percentage were made? Because we have more than 100%, so I guess you could have several answers, or how did it
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, good question. Yep. So they could list up to 3, I think it was. So that's why the percentages come to more than 100%, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
And it was interesting that when we broke it down in terms of different age groups, actually it was the younger students who were less likely, much less likely to strongly agree that they'd welcome the opportunity to learn more about climate change compared to the 18-year-olds. They also were less likely to say that climate change information that they get at school is relevant to their life, and much less likely to agree that their teachers were very knowledgeable about climate change. So I think this is partly to do with the fact that the younger students had less knowledge about climate change, felt less able to kind of talk about climate change. Also, at that age, they've got much less agency as well to actually do something about climate change, arguably. So I think all those factors go some way to explaining why they were less enthusiastic about learning more about climate change because they couldn't see the personal relevance of it so much, whereas the older students were far more likely, to see how it related to their lives and to know a bit more about the issues.
Sorry if I can interrupt you just for a second.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I see there's a question in the chat as well, but um, I think it's not last week, but the week before, we had a presentation by a doctoral student who also related age to the level of anxiety. And he said that younger students were, if I'm not remember correctly, I'm looking at my colleagues here, but that younger students were less anxious than older people. And his hypothesis was that in a way they grew up within the crisis. They've heard about
Yep.
it all their lives. And so they're not that keen on learning more because it's just part of their life. So maybe it's not only a question of agency, but there may be also a different
Mm.
uh, exposition to these topics in since their childhood.
Yeah, I mean, also maybe we were thinking that with the older students, they had more exposure to things like Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg, and perhaps that also was a factor in making them, more receptive to climate change education. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
and there was
another
also
perspective.
during one of the previous sessions, the speaker told about the fact that for students, if they learn about it at school and then they get evaluated on this topic, and I think she gave the example of one of the speeches that Greta Thunberg gave in UN, and they were not interested because instead of focusing on the message, on what Greta Thunberg was saying, they knew that they would get an evaluation, and so they lost interest in a way. The focus was more on the grade they would get rather
Yeah.
than on what they were learning. So that's another, I think it's a real question, a real problem when we want to do climate education. There was a
Yeah.
question before from Corentin. He was asking, what are the socioeconomic backgrounds of those children? I think you partly, yeah.
Right. Okay. So this is the British Science Association study. Yep.
And Catherine is asking me which was the presentation relating to age and anxiety. I think it was Arnaud Sapin, and his presentation was focusing on older students because he was going up to 25 years old, I think. Am I remembering correctly, Catherine? Or maybe did you attend this session? Or anyway, so I think we can go on.
Yeah, so just to answer that, the sample it included slightly more young people who were of a higher socioeconomic positions. So it was skewed a little bit more towards sort of middle class students, which again I think is important to take into account. The problem with a lot of these surveys, and particularly also with online surveys, is that there is a tendency to get to end up with participants who are more highly educated and come from a higher socio-economic position. So it's really difficult to get, a sample to be completely representative. That's always a challenge, unfortunately.
Definitely.
So we also asked the young people in this survey which activities they'd taken part in over the last 6 months. And not surprising in a way, the top one was recycling and food waste, and also using public transport, walking, cycling, car sharing, and things like changing your diet were very rarely mentioned, as was influencing local politicians, businesses, and so on. And again, in terms of thinking about why that might be, it's quite difficult as a young person, wanting to change their diet when, they're reliant often, on their parents for, feeding them. So in a way that's kind of understandable. I guess we also need to take into account that, we're asking about self-reported behaviour here. It may not necessarily be completely reliable. And so, I think that needs to be borne in mind.
Yeah.
We also wanted to know who young people say they're most likely to go to for information and who they trust the most on climate change. And we found that teachers were trusted sources. 43% said they were likely to go to their teachers for information. Scientists, though, came up top as being, the highest number that they said they were very likely to go to. And interestingly, content creators, social media influencers weren't mentioned that much, but in the focus group discussions, it was clear that a lot of young people, and from the earlier piece of research that I did as well, with the schools in the Southwest, a lot of the young people are getting their information from social media, from TikTok, from Instagram, and sources like that. So just to talk a little bit about the focus group findings, and this is kind of, I've taken a couple of quotes here to kind of illustrate some of the main themes. What we found was that teaching was very much constrained by being focused mainly within, so young people were mainly coming across climate change in GCSE, geography and science. Now, the problem with that is that geography in the UK is an optional subject, and not that many students take geography. So there's a large number of students who really, unless they choose to do geography, aren't getting much of an introduction into climate change at the moment. Occasionally, it's something that's covered in PHSE, which is personal and social education. And if they do GCSE science, then they'll come across it. But it's not something that's being tackled in a wide range of subjects. And as you can see here from the comment, I think a problem with only talking about climate change in science is that if children aren't interested in the sciences, then you immediately lose any interest in climate change because it's not integrated well into the other subjects. Is that the case in France as well?
Yeah, I think France is really behind. And I recently read a paper saying that it's getting worse and worse. It should be, I mean, it should be taught more and more, but it's the contrary. And for the same reasons, teachers are
Mhm.
not being trained for that. They don't really know where to start. And yeah, there's a journal called Sciences Humaines, and they published a paper in December 25, so just 2 months ago, and they
Mhm.
said that the French students are behind, I mean, really low behind all other OECD countries. So
Really?
we have no lessons to give to anybody. Um, and part of the difficulty seems to be that French students are also very low in science. You just mentioned science. And so education could come not only into history and geography, but also in science. And it seems to be related to that. So no, it's
Mhm.
really bad. Sorry not to have
Oh
any
dear.
interesting contribution for the UK
Oh,
system.
I was hoping it would be a better situation in France.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Um, we also found that it was very much constrained by exams and the requirements of the exam specifications. Um, and students felt as though, in the main, they were just being kind of taught to pass the exam, and they couldn't really explore the issue in the kind of depth that they wanted to. And it didn't make it interesting for them. It was just about, learning the facts, but not really exploring, the solutions to climate change and going beyond what they, the limited amount of information they needed to know to pass the exam.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
a real problem. I think it's the problem our colleague was talking about the other day about Greta Thunberg.
mhm, mhm. Um, and it was strongly apparent that the teaching focused in the main on the impacts of climate change and didn't talk so much about the causes and hardly featured the solutions at all. Uh, and the problem with this, I think, is that it kind of exacerbates the problem over anxiety about climate change, because if you keep talking about the terrible impacts that are occurring but you don't actually present anything about the solutions, then it tends to leave people feeling very negative, disempowered, and feeling that, as the person mentions in the second quote, people feeling really small, things won't really make much of a difference, and leaving people feeling very depressed rather than actually feeling as though that they can do something about it. Um, and we asked young people to describe some images that they chose that they felt represented what climate change means to them. And this word cloud, shows the words that they most frequently used. And as you can see, destruction, impact on nature, melting ice caps, scary. These were the words that kind of that featured the most. And what was apparent was that they're all very kind of negative, things, doom and gloom. What we didn't find was, any more kind of positive representations featuring very much. I mean, there's one reference to positive action, but in the main, it's all about things that big and drastic, scary impacts and so on. Um, and I think clearly one of the things that comes across from the piece of research that we did is that in order to engage young people with climate change, it needs to be made close to home. We need to take more of a place-based approach, so that when climate change is being covered as a topic in school, although yes, you do need to draw attention to climate justice issues and make students aware of the inequalities and how climate change impacts individuals in different ways, and that the developing world has contributed the most to the problem. But you also, I think, need to give concrete examples that students can relate to, that are kind of real life projects, maybe based around their own school, their own locality, and then they can see the relevance of it to their lives, as opposed to viewing it as this kind of abstract thing that happens to other people that doesn't happen to them. And one of the ways in which this can be done is through using arts-based approaches, creative approaches, with films, documentaries, storytelling, getting students involved themselves in storytelling and thinking up different kind of narratives, and also using schools themselves. So thinking about the grounds of the school and how students get involved in how those grounds are attended, and growing growing their own food, and thinking about how they can study things like the effects of solar panels being installed, and all sorts of there are all sorts of ways of using schools themselves as a kind of environment through which students can study the actual effects of exploring different solutions to the problems, and getting involved themselves. And as came across in the video that unfortunately couldn't play, but it was very apparent that young people want real agency. They want to feel empowered. So this comment here from a student: please teach us beyond the specification. Climate change goes beyond marks in a test. So teach us this, teach us the power we hold even against the government, and how we can influence policy. And this was a kind of comment that came up quite a lot among the older students, who were more like to mention things like political activism and how that can lead to a change in attitudes. And there's also, the potential for intergenerational effects as well, I think. So the impact that young people can have on their parents, on their grandparents, which is important to take into account. And then finally, just to talk about the findings from the survey of the teachers' attitudes. I carried out a cross-sectional national survey of teachers, so just over 8,000 teachers, through, there's an app that teachers can be part of, where they were asked various questions every so often. Every week they get set a particular question to answer, and it's very useful because you get a large number of teachers who are willing to be surveyed on various questions. And so I could only set one question. It's very expensive to actually use this platform. And so the teachers were surveyed on the question of whether or not laws should be passed to integrate climate change and sustainability throughout the primary and secondary curriculum. And around about half of those who were surveyed, of this 8,275, agreed that laws need to be introduced. So, you know, that's quite a radical thing to actually agree that, you know, laws should be introduced to make sure that climate change and sustainability are embedded in the curriculum. And, you know, only 24% disagreed with this, with the remaining participants being unsure. And there wasn't that much difference between the primary and the secondary school teachers either. So, you know, quite strong consensus that we need radical change for this to occur. And what was particularly positive was that I found that there were very high levels of support amongst the teachers in their 20s, those who had recently graduated. In fact, nearly 2/3 of those teachers thought that laws should be passed, whereas older teachers who were 50 and above were much less likely to agree that laws need to be passed. And I guess this, you know, could be to do with partly, you know, with teacher training, that climate change and sustainability issues are featuring a bit more in teacher training now, you know, with the younger teachers being more aware of the issues. And then maybe also with some of the older teachers, you could argue that perhaps they're more aware of some of the actual day-to-day challenges with fitting climate education into an already very crowded curriculum, and perhaps being more conservative, you know, about changing traditional ways of teaching. And we even found that there was some interesting variations amongst teachers teaching different subjects, and maths teachers were found to be the least likely to want laws to be passed, whereas, maybe not that surprising in a way, humanities teachers were the most likely to agree. And again, there was a difference between male and female teachers. And I guess that could relate to the previous point, because we know that humanities teachers are more likely to be female, maths teachers are more likely to be male. So maybe there's kind of some crossover there as well. But in terms of looking at levels of seniority, head teachers were the least likely to agree. And again, we know head teachers are, well, there is a difference actually, because head teachers in primary schools are more likely to be female, but in secondary schools are more likely to be male. So it's not straightforward. But anyway, head teachers overall were less likely to agree, only 38%. And you could argue head teachers are in you know, a very tricky position in that, you know, perhaps they are most likely to be resistant to changing the curriculum in that way because of all the other challenges of running a school and, you know, trying to fit in so many different things within the school day, and being aware of some of the challenges around that. So yeah, interesting variations depending on the age groups, but positive in that, you know, there's certainly much more support amongst the younger teachers than the older ones. So the younger ones coming through, I think this is very positive, have much greater appetite for climate change being embedded right across the curriculum. So just to wrap up then, these are some of my kind of recommendations on the basis of the research that I've carried out. I think climate change needs to break out of the current subject silos, so that it's not just concentrated within science and geography, but it features in every subject. You know, there's actually an organisation in the UK called Teach Your Future, and I would encourage students to have a look at some of their materials. I've given a link at the end of the presentation in the references, and they've got some fascinating resources there. They actually, Teach the Future started this project called think it's track changes, where they've collaborated with teachers and people in the education profession to look at how climate change can be incorporated in every subject within the curriculum. So they've looked at the curriculum and then looked at ways in which climate change can easily be incorporated in different ways. So have a look at, I would definitely encourage you to have a look at their website. And they've also carried out their own surveys as well, which are interesting to look at. Another thing I think that really comes across is that there needs to be much more focus on the solutions. That's what young people are not hearing enough about within the education system. And that also links in with the need, for more careers, focus on the green economy and preparing young people for, the 21st century and the skills that are going to be needed. There's also the issue that I mentioned at the beginning about misinformation and disinformation. And one thing I didn't mention was the rise of AI. And of course, that, is disrupting everything. And so, we need much more of an emphasis on media literacy, so that, the misinformation and disinformation that's circulating online can be easily spotted, and to develop critical thinking skills, so that I think that's absolutely vital, particularly with the rise of AI. Also, I think there needs to be a lot more attention given to climate justice issues. They often tend to be swept under the carpet, and there's a tendency, I think, to talk about climate change almost in kind of in a neutral way, and avoid thinking about, how the problems are associated with, looking at things like the capitalist system, colonialism, and so on and so forth, and the way in which, yet again, developing countries, are taking the brunt of this, and there needs to be much more attention given to that. Also, when designing the curriculum, I think we need to give thought to how progression from early years to higher education is made coherent, so that the way you design it is that you build it gradually right across the curriculum, starting from the very early years right through to universities and further education. And then I was thinking about, well, what approach is most suitable for teaching climate change? And what comes across strongly from the studies I've been involved with, and also other recent work as well, is that what works best, I think, is a kind of project-led approach that's rooted in experiential learning, that is place-based, so it's made locally relevant to the student, and it makes it much more engaging if they can see how it relates to their own school or their own local area, and providing practical ways in which they can actually play a part in the solutions. And there are all sorts of opportunities as well, I think, for using virtual reality, immersive experiences. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, really, about the need to connect emotionally with people. Just giving facts doesn't work. It doesn't automatically translate into action. Whereas if you take a more kind of creative approach that involves connecting with people's emotions and their motivations, that is much more likely to spur a real change in outlook and a desire to actually change action. But clearly all of this is extremely difficult and challenging, because in order to radically change the curriculum, it involves, many more resources being devoted to this. It also involves major changes being made to training, to professional development of teachers being given more support. And so politically, this is incredibly challenging, especially within, the context that many countries are finding at the moment where they're struggling. But arguably, the costs of not doing this are, in the long term, infinitely greater. So I think I will end it there, and then we've got a bit of time, I think, for some discussion. And I think hopefully Pascal will circulate these slides and you can have a look at some of the further reading that I've suggested. As you can see here, there's the link to Teach the Future that I mentioned a moment ago.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. It was very interesting, very rich. I'm looking forward to reading the references that you gave. You were asking about the situation in France, and so I thought there was one recent initiative which I think was quite interesting. It was a call for project by the French National Center for Scientific Research, and it was about it was called Ocean and Climate, and the call was about art and science. And I mentioned it because you just mentioned both the importance of integrating these questions into the curriculum. And you focused on real life projects. You talked about art-based approach or inquiry-based project and student-led projects. So I think it's really relevant, and it's not only for students. The call was had several challenges, and one of the challenge was sharing with the public the discovery of the ocean and its associated social issues. Well, my English, sorry. And there was one of the sub challenges was called stimulating the emotional dimension of the ocean by combining science and art, while offering a new perspective on scientific questions and societal issues. So I thought it was interesting that they included this dimension because indeed, as you said, information is not enough. We need to get people to be able to feel close and emotionally involved. And so I recently just received a little grant to start a project. I didn't receive the answer to this call. I answered with a call with a project called Listening to the Ocean, Listen to the Ocean, Understand the Climate. And so I hope it's going to work. And
that's really interesting.
And I could send it to you because I'm going to work with one of your colleagues from Cornwall. You mentioned Cornwall in your
yes.
talk. His name is called Russell Arnott, and he created something called Incredible Oceans. I don't know if
I know
it.
Russell. Yeah.
So he's going to be part of the project. And I could send it to you because the whole idea is to start from sounds in the ocean that we usually cannot hear. For instance, we have a researcher who is recording the sounds of the corals, and nobody can hear the corals because even if you're diving, you have all the bubbles and all the noise that you're making. I'm not a diver, so I don't know about it, but that's what I've heard. And so she's also a sound engineer, so she's putting mics in the corals, both in lively corals and corals who are kind of dead because of the climate change. And she's going to study the difference between both environments. There are also people recording fish's hearts without touching them, so they have mics that can record the sound of the fish's heart, which I think is very
That's
moving.
incredible.
So
Yeah.
the idea is to get these sounds and to make the students listen to it, but also to start with some artists who are very involved into the preservation of the oceans. And so I'm working with someone who is an artist and who is also a specialist of metal music. So we put metal at the heart of the project because there are some bands who are really very strongly engaged into the fight again, or at least into talking about climate change or helping association. And also it's often metal is very intense, and it's in a way the tradition of angry people. It's a protest. So we think it could be a nice door opening, but the idea is then to provide pedagogical support for teachers and who would like to be involved in that, and create things with their students. It's really art-based project. And what is going to be produced does not have to have anything to do with metal. It can
No.
be poems, it can be theater, it can be videos, documentaries, whatever. But it would be a real life project. And what this seminar may be aware of is also it should be completely disconnected from evaluation, because that would spoil the effect.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
we've started a little pilot. It started last Monday with one team
Ah,
in outside Paris, in a city called Mont-Solemin. And he did his first session, and he said that the students were kind of surprised by the use of metal music. He's himself a metalhead and playing metal, but so he made them listen to one song and then starting to produce their own things. And they're going to meet again in a month. So that's really a first initiative, and we'll see what kind of feedback we get. And but I'd be happy to discuss it further after the seminar with you if you're interested.
yeah. That sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear more
Yeah,
about
yeah, I
that.
can send you the
Definitely.
presentation.
Yep.
You have one in English. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds really good.
Do you have any further question about the presentation? Yeah, Claire? Catherine. Oh, Catherine, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Sorry.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for this. It was really wonderful. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the first study that you did. I didn't catch the name of the study. Was it visualizing climate or something? Was
That's
that
right. Visualizing climate change. Yeah.
okay? Yeah, yeah. And so, can you talk a little bit more about what you were saying and working with images, working with
Yep.
creative
Yep.
things like that? And what age were the students that were involved in it, and how did you find them? How did you recruit them into the focus groups?
Yeah, yeah, to say a little bit more about that. So the age of the students was between 14 and 16. And we recruited them through contacts with local schools. We deliberately wanted to have a range of schools. So some of the young people were in schools that were in quite deprived areas. And many of the children who attended those schools had sort of they were from fairly low socioeconomic backgrounds. And then we also had some schools where the students, were much more likely to be in higher socioeconomic groups. And it was a really interesting collaboration. I hadn't done it before with a filmmaker and an artist. And the idea that we came up with was the artist created this interactive game around climate change with different images to do with the causes of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And then that game was kind of used as a way in to get the young people to talk about what they really felt about climate change. And it was very successful because through using that kind of arts-based approach, it kind of drew in the students to the conversation much more. I think it was a bit more challenging with those who were in the schools that were in sort of quite deprived areas. It was easier with some of the other schools where I think young people were more used to kind of these types of discussions. And then the filmmaker also interviewed some of the students on camera, and unfortunately, you couldn't hear what they were saying in that video clip, but I'll send a copy of that so you can hear what they were saying. And as I say, the discussions that we had with the young people were filmed, and that was part of a film that was shown at the Glasgow Climate Change Summit in 2021.
And that's the film that you weren't going to show us the whole film, perhaps, but can we see that film somewhere? Is that available online, or has it been?
Yeah, I can send sort of various clips if you're interested.
I would personally be very, very, very interested. And the other question I had was, when you went into those schools to recruit for the focus groups, particularly in, say, the disadvantaged schools, was this another case where you were asking teachers who do you think might be interested in participating, or was it a general call, or did you speak to everyone in an age group, or how did that work?
No, it wasn't who do you think will be interested. It was, for example, one school we approached the geography teacher, and then we came into his class. Although I suppose you could argue that those students who had chosen to do geography perhaps were more interested in the issues, so you've always got that kind of limitation. So I mean, I certainly wouldn't claim that it was completely representative by any means.
No, it was more about, do you speak to people who you think are already interested in the subject, or do you think it's more of how do we get access to those students who are maybe not thinking about these questions?
That's always the difficulty, isn't it? And I mean, that was apparent even in some of the discussions where you could tell some of the students who, clearly weren't that interested kind of took a back seat, and, you could tell by the expression that they weren't so interested. Whereas others got very, very animated because they clearly thought about the issues, and they really wanted to kind of engage on the topic.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I'd love to hear more about if you've had any methodological publications or anything else, or maybe Pascal can send them on. But yeah,
sure. Yeah. Put you in touch, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I've published, there's an article in Climatic Change which is on the PowerPoint list of references, so I definitely recommend having a look at that, because there's quite a lot of discussion in there on the methods and some of the challenges around that.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. And I have a final question, and then I'll pass on to somebody else. But Pascal actually mentioned some of the work that I've been doing with I've just done some preliminary interviews on this project for the moment. But one of the things that I'm hearing from French and Belgian teenagers on this issue is that they feel like they've heard too much about climate change. And so one of the reservations that I have, and they're kind of just like, oh, we know it's important. It's but really, do we have to keep talking? It's another conference on climate change. And so when I read like policy recommendations about breadth and incorporating it into all aspects of the curriculum, which is something we see obviously in the EU Green Comp or the OECD recommendations as well, it also talks about interdisciplinarity and the importance of humanities and the importance of art and that's short. But I'm thinking these kids are also telling me that they see too much of it. So I'm wondering if the problem is, I mean, that might be a false impression as well. Like they have the impression that everybody's talking about it, but is it maybe a question of breadth versus depth? And in fact, what they maybe want is increasing complexity. And is there an issue with how do we cover this area in all of its complexity? And you've talked about drawing in, political and economic. I'm a political scientist, so that's what I'm more interested in. How do we bring the political elements into, and how do we politicize it so that it doesn't become depoliticized?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I mean, there's quite a lot of resistance, I think, as well, to covering the political aspects within them. And but I think that is definitely necessary. I mean, it's something that could be covered within a topic like citizenship studies, which lends itself really well to that. But the powers that be, for obvious reasons, resist, really covering those aspects because, it challenges powerful interests, basically.
Yeah, that's it. So tricky.
It is very, very tricky. Yeah. And I mean, I kind of see what you're getting at as well with, this issue of information overload. And also there's a danger, that people just become desensitized to it because, but having said that, at the moment, there is also a lot of evidence that climate change, isn't being, or very rarely being mentioned in many school, curricula at all. And I guess it's also this feeling that students might have that, also when you look at media coverage and social media, if it's coming up a lot there as well, then maybe that's also affecting their perception that, they're getting too much information about it.
Yeah.
But I think it comes back again to, a lot of what we're hearing about climate change is to do with the impacts, but not the solutions. And I think if there was much more focus on the solutions, then perhaps people wouldn't feel so kind of overloaded with the issue because they would appreciate then that there are solutions that are being taken, that are happening now, and that we are making progress, and that there are, other solutions being explored as well. So it's kind of balancing the negative messages with more positive messages that give people agency, empowerment. I think is important.
And linking to agency, linking to action.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most powerful things people can do is to put pressure on politicians for change, because there is a limitation with what individuals can do. Yes, we can change our diet. Yes, we can, go via public transport. We can, change our energy consumption and things like that. But the key thing really is to bring about more large-scale change by putting pressure on politicians, because that is where fundamental changes, can occur.
Yeah, hence the importance of making sure that it's politicized through education. There's that link is made to citizenship action. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
And that's easier to do with older students than with younger ones as well. I think as a younger student, you don't really appreciate, politics in its wider sense.
Well, that's really what my research is on that sort of 12 to 14-year-old age group and that adolescent dip in interest. So why is it that we see interest and concern in primary school students, and then there's this drop off, and then it comes back again at the end of the, so.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think also part of it's to do with, other external factors as well around, what's going on in
life.
As you become a teenager,
absolutely,
your values and so on.
Sorry. What you're saying is related to one question that we have in the chat, and I see there's also one question by Christina, and after that we'll have to stop because we have to stop earlier today because we have some students who have to give their presentation. So Yuki, who is a Japanese student who is working on competition in education, has a question about the curriculum reform, which is, I think you partly just answered in your discussion with Catherine, and thank you, Catherine, for your interesting question and contribution. So his question was, when it comes to curriculum reform, in addition to environmental education, there are also some possibilities about changes in education from the perspective more neoliberal and human capital, such as teaching about money, investment, which means the curriculum doesn't necessarily move toward environmental protection. So education is vital for the station état-nation. I think it's mixed of French and English, and the economy for the force of humans. So how do you envision opposing such forces? I think it's what you just said, and I think as long as we encourage people to change their diet and how do you say, sort out their garbage, it's okay. But if we start to go on onto the political questions, it's going to be difficult.
Yes, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Christina? This is going to be our last question for today. If you still have a question and if you're still with us online, maybe not.
Yes, sorry, I was trying
to
unmute myself. I'm sorry. Just a bit of background. I'm, among other issues, I'm the chair of the Environmental Transition Board at the University of Bordeaux, which is a group composed of experts, students, teachers, to support the university in the transition to a more environmental and social society. So we look at all aspects, including the curricula, how they deal with environmental issues. One thing that frequently comes up in our discussions is really the disconnect between the expectation that students should do something. I mean, of course, first of all, they should know about environmental issues and climate change. And now at the University of Bordeaux, it's compulsory to take a course on environmental issues for all new students. There is this compulsory course, which I think is a great way to put them up to scratch. But what really comes up often is this disconnect between what is expected from the individual and how governments really relinquish their obligation to protect people from climate change, to issue the right regulations, and how much is expected really from the individuals that had nothing to do with creating the situation. So I think this is a very important tension that comes up, I mean, at all levels, probably not at primary school level, but certainly as young people grow older, they're saying, well, why are you making me responsible for finding the solution? And you see governments rolling back environmental protections, providing subsidies to fossil fuel companies. So, so this is, I think, a major issue that needs to be handled also. I mean, and not left to students to juggle with. I mean, with this, they are being made responsible, and those who are responsible are not doing their job. So, I think also connecting the politics, because climate change, in the end, I mean, even if it's politicized, it is a consequence of political decisions by individuals of putting us into a carbon locked in society. But I think it's the earlier the better also, that children and students are made aware that climate change is not a natural phenomenon at its origin. It's really man-made. And the second point very quickly is also, not only should young people know that this is based on human decisions, but also that it can be changed based on human decisions. And also that our vote as members of society is very important to change it. And also the way we handle our money, our finances, is very important, because a lot of our money helps support a society that we don't want, because our money in the bank is then used to finance projects we don't want. So I think the earlier also children get this awareness and some kind of financial education, the better they will be equipped to be empowered to do something through their vote, through their money, and through their knowledge. It's more a comment than a question, but of course, if you have anything to add to that, I would be very keen to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think, you know, it's a very kind of challenging thing, but I think, you know, that there does need to be much more consideration of those aspects, and including the financial, as you mentioned. You know, I think a lot of young people aren't necessarily aware of, you know, factors that could affect, you know, which bank they choose to bank with, and maybe not aware of, you know, the aspects that they need to kind of, you know, consider around those issues.
Yeah, financial education, I think, is a real total blind
Yeah.
spot in education.
Yeah.
And it could be changed.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
I
very
mean,
much.
that is one thing actually that the curriculum and assessment review final report, it does acknowledge that there needs to be more attention given to things like financial education, but whether that in the end will be linked to climate change, I don't know, or whether it's more just, you know, equipping students to you know, be more savvy in how they handle their money. I don't know.
Well, I mean, banks encourage children to put their 10 cents into their own little account, but then children don't know where that money goes. So I think this
No.
chain of information should continue. It doesn't stay in the bank. This bank goes somewhere, and you can, if you put it in the right bank, you can also decide, well, this goes to windmills instead of oil extraction. So I think that's part of financial education from the very beginning. From very young children, as soon as they get pocket money, they should know about these issues.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much for all this contribution, and I think it's nice that we managed to open even new avenues. As I said in the beginning of this seminar, this is the last session for this year, but I'm definitely going to pursue this topic next year. So I hope we'll meet again soon, and Alison, I'll write to you about the other project. I think it would be very nice to keep in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Alison, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.